Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is an author, journalist and the literary editor of The Spectator. He's been a judge of every major UK literary award, including the Booker and the Baillie Gifford Prizes, and has been a columnist for The Guardian, the FT and the Evening Standard. His previous non-fiction work includes Dead Poets, Sod's Law and You Talking to Me. His novel, The Coincidence Engine, about secret agents investigating wild coincidences, was shortlisted for the Bollinger Everyman Woodhouse Prize for Comic Fiction. His latest work, A History of Childhood Reading, is The Haunted Wood. Sam Leith, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Hello, thank you for having me.
What was the first book that really inspired you? What's the first thing you remember reading?
First thing I remember reading, I do have a very strong memory of reading, I think it would have been probably Ladybird, but one of the, a very standard, unliterary, kind of crunched down version of the Robin Hood legend. And as a tiny thing, being in floods and floods of tears at the end when Robin, on his deathbed fires an arrow out of the window where he's going to be buried. And I remember, I think, B.B.'s, Dennis Watkins Pitchford's book, Lord of the Forest, which bizarrely is a novel about an oak tree. So, not a lot of geographical movement in that. But that also had me in tears at the end. So I sort of realised quite early on the power of children's writing. And I confess to being a complete Nancy Drew addict when I was a youngster as well.
Oh, me too. Love Nancy Drew. Was it a literary household?
Well, yes, I think it was. I mean, my parents had lots of books. My dad he'd been an actor. He grew up in South Africa and came to England when he was in his late teens, early 20s, to go to university, actually. And he was an English graduate, and he worked as an actor for the first, unfortunately he wasn't good enough at being an actor to keep being an actor, because we all have starved to death. But so he was very important to me, and I among my early memories, as I describe in this book, as being read the Kipling's Just So stories by my dad. And my mother's a writer; she's a journalist and author and biographer. So it was very much a household where words were a thing.
You went to Magdalen College.
Oxford, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Tell us more. What were you studying?
I studied English literature. I mean, essentially, the whole story of my career and life is of someone who wanted to read books and write about them, and I'm a perpetual English student. So I, at school, English was the subject I really loved. I went on at university to do English language and literature at Magdalen and adored it. I had, fortunately, I think, the nous to realise I'd make a really bad academic. I was too... I did think about staying on, but I realised that I was too naturally wedded to deadlines and jokes and the prospect of publication and indeed even being paid. So I became a journalist, but, as if by kind of gravitational pull, I think I was always trying to swim in the direction of being the literary journalist I am now. I mean, obviously, those jobs don't come up all that often, but... finally I've landed exactly where I want to be, which is the opportunity to read books and write about them for a living.
And write books. You've written a lot of books.
Oh yeah, a handful. I mean, I've got friends who seem to find it easier and quicker. But I remember saying to the publisher of my first book, Dead Pets, which was a terrible failure. I said to Jamie Byng of Canongate, a year or two after it, I said, "Well, Jamie, I'm so grateful you published that book because." I know it didn't sell very well and it was all, kind of a great failure. But, it's just all I'd ever wanted really was to have a book with my name on the cover. And he said, well, we wanted it to sell. I realised it was insensitive of me. But
Your next book was also with Canongate. Dead Pets is all about, dead pets.
It is. It was cooked up with my agent, the late David Miller, when I think we were just having a sort of riotous lunch in Pizza Express, and I was then, I guess, in my mid-20s, and we basically found ourselves just falling about laughing, talking about Rinker, the famous scandal involving Jeremy Thorpe and this Great Dane that got shot, and sort of we both shared a kind of black sense of humour. And somehow, out of this, 2-bottle lunch, emerged the idea that I would write a book about, Rinker and Laika the space dog, and it was intended to be a kind of, essentially kind of black-hearted book about animal mortality, but it fell perfectly between two stools because, on the one hand, it contained a strand which was extremely sentimental about my cat. on the other hand, it had this... So, the bad taste people would have been revolted by the sentimental side, and the cat lovers would all have been a little bit horrified by the section on, how to eat dogs and guinea pigs and so forth.
Why Life Always Falls Butter Side Down, that's a subtitle of Sod's Law. Tell us about that book.
Well, that was the proposal of my then publisher and now agent, Toby Mundy. That was another... I'm afraid poor old Toby proposed this book when he was the publisher at Atlantic Books, and he said, I reckon you can do a quick... I can't remember how much it was sort of 30,000, 40,000 words. And the idea was just to do a sort of reboot of a book that some of your listeners might remember called The Book of Heroic Failures by Stephen Pyle, which sold absolute scads in, I guess, the mid to late 80s. So the idea was just to try and do something that would be a really funny Christmas gift book, be an anthology of funny stories about failure. And obviously the funny thing was that it was a failure too.
And then you branched into fiction.
Yes, and I wrote a novel called The Coincidence Engine, which I still definitely feel fondly towards, and it did, as you said, you reminded me, which was very gratifying, that it got a nod for the Bollinger Comic Fiction Prize. And it was a sort of comic road trip, literary theoretical romance, spy thriller, science fiction novel.
Sounds fantastic.
I just obviously chucked the kitchen sink into it. And it was really fun to write, but really difficult to write. And actually, I think it did me a lot of good, not so much in terms of my reputation as a novelist, but as a critic, because for years, my main job or a main thread in my journalistic life had been writing book reviews. And I'd started out with that kind of attitude that I think every fresh out of university English literature graduate age 23 or 24 who starts reviewing books is, you're out to be ferocious, you're out to make a reputation, you're out to kind of de haut en bas tell Kazuo Ishiguro where he's going wrong. And I'd always thought, when I came to have friends who were writers and they'd say, I'm working on my new novel, it's so difficult. I think, it can't be that bloody hard, you just make it up. And doing it yourself is a very humbling experience. You suddenly realise, actually, it is incredibly difficult. And the people who do it well are operating at a level, that really, really commands profound respect. And so it was a very good, I think it probably made me a more humble and more cautious critic to know what it was like to actually write fiction. Because the hard thing, of course, is you can just make it up, but, the point at which a sequence of events becomes a story, and the question of, does it matter what colour the door is, or whether your characters turn left or right, or whether the room's on the first floor or the ground floor, you get complete option paralysis. So it was a really interesting experience. And I'd love to write more fiction, but, maybe I was too humbled.
But it's lovely. I mean, particularly in this book, the way that everything is, every sentence is polished. You can tell that there's been so much work. It's not just a and then, is it? It's beautifully crafted.
Well,
and I think
that's very, very nice of you to say so. And some of the credit for that must go to my editor, Chech Steen, at One World, who was extremely good at going through in a really granular way, saying, too much here, too little here, this needs a bit of a polish, this clause is in the wrong place. But I do try hard to get the prose right, because I don't think you can really get away without it.
Tell us about that side of it then, being a reviewer, how you approach a review, say of a book you don't particularly like.
Well, my kind of view after years of doing this is that the best advice you can kind of give to any critic is to say you have to review the book in terms of what it is trying to be, rather than in terms of what you think it ought to have been. And therefore, the first job of the critic is figure out what the book's trying to do, and then figure out whether it succeeds on its own terms. Now, you can say, this isn't my cup of tea, and sometimes, ideally, you'll be sent a book with whose project you are naturally in sympathy. But I think the sort of review that complains that Dan Brown's sentences are clumsy, Dan Brown can't write, is a sort of slightly point-missing review, because the world is absolutely stuffed with people who can't write. The question of why, of all those people who can't write, Dan Brown is the one who's sold 5 million copies is the more interesting question. And I think, if you review genre fiction in a snooty way as if it's, failing to be literary fiction, you're missing the point. I don't think it doesn't matter how things are written, because, all books are made out of sentences and words, and, if the bricks are rotten, the house is going to fall down. But it matters in different ways how things are written, I think. And, there are lots of qualities a book can have that make it work that aren't at sentence level. I mean, that's less so probably for literary fiction, but I think, you need to be attentive to, what the book's trying to do. And that's, for me, the bottom line of it all.
Why do you think Dan Brown has sold so well?
I think he sells well because I think he's good at plot and pacing. I mean, the fact the plot's ridiculous and that the pacing is kind of harum-scarum sort of doesn't matter. I mean, he's got the Dickens trick of every chapter ends on a cliffhanger or a reversal. I mean, another writer I very much admire, who again at sentence level is not all that much, is Harlan Coben. I mean, every Harlan Coben book, there's a character in the first page who's dead, who will turn out to be alive later on, or who's alive but turns out to be dead all along, or, there's always these extraordinary, audacious switchbacks. And, they keep you reading. And that page-turny stuff, I think, works tremendously well. I think the reason that sometimes critics, particularly the young turkey-cocking kind of, I know everything type, young men, and normally men who are most arrogant like that, is that there is a thing in book reviewing that there's something implicitly kind of agonistic or competitive about a book review because, the review is made out of the same stuff that the object of study is made out of, i.e. prose. And, people don't review ballet in dance. They don't review architecture in buildings, but you do review prose in prose. And therefore, if you're telling off or attacking a writer, you kind of have to be saying at some level, I'm better at this than you.
Yeah.
Which, as I say, is why writing some fiction was a good corrective to that tendency in me.
This latest book, The Haunted Wood, you say this is a history of childhood reading rather than children's books.
Well, I do that in order to try and cast my net wide and to try and avoid a little bit the way in which... I mean, I know that now we very much kind of silo and segment, publishing markets. And there is, there's middle grade and there's YA and there's all this sort of stuff. But certainly that's a fairly recent invention. And I wanted to give a nod to, well, two things. One is that, what children read is very different from what's written for children very often. And, we know from marketing that for instance, a substantial part of the audience for so-called YA books is women in their 30s. And we also know that you can find a 9-year-old who will be happily chomping through Pride and Prejudice or a translation of the Iliad. And I wanted to nod to the way in which children's reading it's on a continuum. And, as I think I say in the introduction, a true account of childhood reading might take into fact that, say, children of my generation would supplement their Nancy Drew books with, a peek at the smutty bits of Shirley Conran or Harold Robbins in their parents' bookshelf. And similarly, further back, there wasn't really any distinction made. I mean, what I'm writing about here is the story in a way of how children's literature came to be invented, and it's a relatively recent story because before, maybe to telescope several hundred years of social history, before you can have children's literature, you have to A, teach children to read, and B, stop stuffing them up chimneys as soon as they're big enough to climb. And so, the soil out of which children's literature grows, which is fairy tale and folk tale and myth, didn't make a distinction between adult and child audiences. There weren't separate, as it were, bestseller lists. But, if you look at the bestseller lists in the year of Little Lord Fauntleroy, there's no distinction made between so-called adult books and children's books, and indeed books that are now being read as children's books that were then read by everybody. So it's a very kind of open field of inquiry. So I didn't want to shut that down at the subtitle level. Also, a lot of children's writers now, which I feel encouraged by, don't attempt to cut that down either. Someone like Alan Garner says, I write for whoever I write for, and Garner's work is very available and very rewarding for adults as it is for children. Philip Pullman too, doesn't label himself a children's writer. So I think we can respect that and simply say, come to them as, I'm looking at how children would approach them really, rather than looking at how they're sold to children.
You quote Martin Amis, who's very rude about children's writing.
Well, he is, yes. I mean, he's a writer I absolutely revere. And so I felt a little bit of a pardon my language, a little bit of a shithill for attacking him in the opening page of the book. But interviewed by Sebastian Faulks for Sebastian's series on the novel or on fiction. I think Sebastian just asked him, was a throwaway question, Martin, will you ever think of writing a children's book? Then he said, well, only if I have got brain damage. He went on to say, which perhaps, softens that for him, writing is freedom, and I won't accept any constraints on what I write, in as much as he's arguing that there are some necessary constraints when writing to children. That's probably fair enough, though if you look at someone like Gardner or T.H. White or even Pullman, those constraints are pretty wide. You can do an awful lot for and in that zone. But I think the sort of brain damage thing, the idea that there's inherently something a bit stupid about children's literature, that it's a kind of thinner, more trivial version of the grown-up sort, is something I felt I wanted to push back on very strongly, because my argument in the book is that, as well as being more kind of umbilically connected to those basic original forms of storytelling in the oral tradition, the myths, the fairy tales, the folk tales, it's also the platform on which every reading life is based. Everybody who goes on to become a writer, no matter how experimental or highbrow or difficult or important, air quotes, they started out reading The Tiger Who Came to Tea or The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and without it, they'd never have got there.
You take us through this. Every chapter is sort of structured to give us a different inflection point, if you like, within children, the development of literature. You talk about Aesop obviously being hugely important, and fables and the moralists. Then we come to Lewis Carroll, of course.
Well, I mean, most accounts of the kind of history of children's literature basically say it begins in its modern form with Lewis Carroll, and I don't really dissent from that. I find Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, it's a deeply, deeply strange book, as you'll know, and in a way, for something that stands at the head of the canon, it doesn't seem to be directly influential in the way you might expect, because it's so sui generis. It's kind of a really hard act to follow. But I think in as much as it turns around to the 150-odd years that preceded it of really aggressively didactic, moralising, sort of puritanical, and I mean that in a kind of theological sense, literature, which was intended essentially to instill moral lessons in children rather than to entertain them. And it turned around and blew this fantastically audacious raspberry in the face of that tradition. I mean, so many of the songs we remember, the funny songs that go through Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, are direct parodies of things like, Isaac Watts's, pious hymns for children. And so it starts out saying we can be fun, we can be silly, and fun and silly are worth doing in and of themselves. And at that point, I think you're kind of away to the races.
Mm-hmm. I'm really interested to talk about Kipling because, like your father, a huge fan, also from a sort of colonial background, and I think a lot of people from that Southern African or Indian background are very drawn to Kipling, but of course, we're told that we shouldn't be.
Yeah, the cancellation of Kipling troubled me when I was writing this book. There was one of the waves of cancellation sort of happened while I was gearing up towards this, and there was, every now and again there's someone notices a Kipling statue or a Kipling plaque, and you get him. I mean, Kipling is, and I would certainly admit, he's problematic in as much as his views were of his time. He was an unapologetic imperialist. He did write The White Man's Burden, which has those patronising othering lines about half devil and half child. But he's also the writer who wrote You're a Better Man Than I Am, Gunga Din. And for a start, his influence is unignorable, in as much as, even if we thought we wanted to cancel him, we can't, because he invented, or practically invented, or put rocket fuel under whole genres of children's literature. There's homemade fairy tales and just so stories. Is the boarding school story and Storky and Co. He really invented its modern form. It existed before that in Tom Brown's School Days and in Mrs. Fielding's The Little Ladies' Academy, The Little Women's Academy, and Kim, the kind of Great Game Adventure story, and of course The Jungle Book. And he is such a good writer. I mean, those books are astounding and fresh today, but also the things of which he's accused in terms of being a kind of crude white supremacist, he's so not. And his legacy is complex, and his view of, he had the most fantastic curiosity and interest in and respect for the, as it were, subject peoples of the empire. Kim is all about, the white sahibs are kind of ridiculous in Kim, and Kim exists, and Kipling revels in this kind of macaronic, identity-changing, using all the different languages, and he borrows incredibly from all the sort of, many, many languages of India and Southern Africa and the folk traditions. And the Jungle Book, Mowgli is not, white civilization or even mankind are not the top of the tree in the Jungle Book. They're seen as sort of rather barbaric, and the animals have a much roolier and more honourable world. So the idea that Kipling is some sort of pith-hatted, crass golf club bore who saw the, peoples of India and Southern Africa and the other outposts of empire as a kind of undifferentiated brown mass who were to be kind of kept down with the whip, is to grotesquely misread this really complex and interesting legacy.
You take us through all these various points, as I say, through Edwardian England, where, of course, the laws changed. Children were protected, so that had an effect on literature. And I'm slightly rushing us through this because I want to get to another writer who we are sniffy about these days, perhaps always were, and that is Enid Blyton.
Yes, well, she's another one whose influence is utterly unignorable, who's also eminently cancelable. I mean, I don't think she didn't have any of Kipling's interest and curiosity in, foreign cultures. I mean, Blyton, I think, is, in a weird way, she's like a kind of diffusion range E. Nesbit, as I see her, because Nesbit, was a brilliant writer and sort of to some extent set the pattern in terms of starting her own magazine, in terms of corresponding enthusiastically and really kind of, cleverly with her readership. She cultivated her readers in the way that Blyton went on to do. And Nesbit was a huge, wrote in very many different genres, promoted herself very well. She kind of set the pattern. And Enid Blyton did that too. And she did it very effectively, and she cleverly kind of fitted adult genres into children's forms. So you've got these sort of, spy thrillers and adventure stories and detective stories and she's sort of fantastically omnivorous in terms of what she'd sort of brand. She issued all these books, now kind of mostly, we remember the famous five and so forth. But, there are endless now out of print things of, Enid Blyton's Bible stories, Enid Blyton's classical myths, Enid Blyton's fairy tales. She went and kind of did her versions of everything. She put her stamp on everything. I don't think she's a deeply interesting writer, sentence by sentence. Here's the snooty, literary critic in me coming out. But she was a hugely effective one, not just as a marketing machine. Those stories did draw children and keep them reading. And she's fascinating, I think, because of the place she takes in the English imaginarium. She's in this post-war world. She's creating a bucolic idea of childhood, which is, very English. It's not very Scottish or Welsh or Irish, certainly not international, which is rooted in the countryside, which is full of feasts, all those lashings and lashings of ginger beer and clotted cream teas, which we mock her for. They were really potent fantasies in the post-war years, as was the idea of this wholesome kind of countryside adventures, when actually most of her readership would have been living in bombed-out cities.
Or, in my case, reading it in Zimbabwe and thinking, daffodils, I've never seen a daffodil. And even to this day, when I see daffodils, I'm absolutely thrilled. I can hardly believe I'm in England.
God, yes, no, I bet. And there is a tradition of people who do that. I think the Fairchild family, author of an absolutely kind of hair-raising, very early 19th century, Puritan tract, but whose first book, Little Henry and His Bearer, which is she was living in India, because empire. And there were these wonderful descriptions of that world, which I think were would have been exotica in the other direction,
yes,
that her English readership would have gone, it's like that.
We don't have a lot of time left, Sam, but I just want to look to the future of literature, of children's literature in particular, because, of course, we're seeing libraries close, we're seeing certainly the space for reviewing children's fiction in the media very much shrunk. What does the future hold, and where do we go in terms of technology versus the written word?
Well, I mean, I agree with you. There's a lot of reason to be gloomy, and it's lovely to see our current and former children's laureates, Frank Cottrell Boyce and Michael Rosen, both of them absolutely mighty figures speaking out so strongly and clearly against the closure of libraries. Libraries were my gateway to the world, as they will have been for so many children. I'm slightly less gloomy than some about the idea that screen-based entertainments are going to kind of wipe out children's literature. I think we have heard, generation by generation, every new technology comes along and people panic about it. And the same anxiety attended the arrival of television. And in the 50s, there was Hilda Himmelwhite, the sociologist, commissioned to look into the effects of television on children while it was still possible to have a control group for the experiment. They went to, I think it was Stevenage, which didn't yet have a TV tower, and they did a longitudinal study with children in households with TVs and children in households that couldn't yet get them. And they found that actually, oddly enough and encouragingly, television, though initially the novelty meant that children spent less time per week reading, with most of the subjects, they came back to reading, and in the long term, they found that actually television helped supplement reading. And I don't know whether in your childhood you were getting Jackanory over some international BBC World type thing, but things like Jackanory and Storytime and Play School, and television adaptations of things became kind of gateways to books, and things hopped back and forth. When I was a child, the Terence Dicks Doctor Who novelisations were a huge thing. So television became part of an ecosystem which could even be supportive of books. And I think there's reason to hope. I mean, I don't want to draw an exact analogy between television and current screens, because we know that, television doesn't have that sort of dopamine loop gaming, sticky, addictive psychology thing that Silicon Valley is now so good at. I don't want to be complacent about it. But I like to think that as part of a mixed diet, children can and will, if they're encouraged to realise, you have to get the hook set, you have to, get them to read some books in the first place. But once a child realises that there's a different sort of pleasure and interest, that there's something that the written word in Dead Tree or even Kindle format can supply that a PlayStation can't, I think that's the work done. I think they'll realise that, this is available, it's here, and there is a different pleasure to be had from it, and that goes on. And I've seen it happen with my own children, so I'm not as gloomy as I might be.
And I mean, one of the wonderful things about this book is going through it as an adult reader and just remembering, oh yes, and that, oh and that, and you brought me so much pleasure, just prompting memories of these fantastic early reading experiences.
Well, I hope so. That's certainly part of what it's intended to do, and part of why it was such a pleasure to research and write. Yeah.
Well, it's such a pleasure to read. Sam Leith, many thanks for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you.
The Haunted Wood by Sam Leith is published by One World. It's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu, who also edited the show. And you can download this programme and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.